460. And here we go. Hey, everyone. Welcome to episode 466 of the All Dolphins podcast. Friday, February 21st, 2025. We have a new face joining us on the podcast. First-time guest, my good friend, Fran Duffy of the, I should know this by heart, but I had to look because that's the kind of production value you get here on the All Dolphins podcast, of the All City Network, which covers everything in Philadelphia, Dallas, Phoenix, Chicago, Denver. Fran is a longtime Philadelphia Eagles reporter and a longtime draft analyst. So we're going to be talking about Eagles, drafts, Dolphins. Fran, how are you, my friend?
Alan, I'm doing great, man. It's great to jump on with you. It's one of my favorite times of year. And I know, look, one of the reasons why it's one of my favorite times of year, I get to run into you next week in Indianapolis. So very much looking forward to that.
This deserves a heart. And hopefully, if time allows, as we discussed before, and hopefully we can do our annual dinner. But
that's right.
That's for next week. For now, we're going to talk about. I guess we should start with the Eagles, the team that you know and love. You've covered for quite a bit. Super Bowl run, Super Bowl champions for the second time in 8 years.
Yep.
And guess the expectation would be that everybody's going to copy the formula, build the trenches, spend draft pick after draft pick after draft pick on the offensive line, defensive line, because it's a copycat league. Am I pretty close on the ball here?
Yeah, it's just so funny because I've heard that a lot. Listening to podcasts and different media outlets over the last couple of weeks since the Super Bowl, and it's like, man, like that should have been the way you've been doing it anyway, right? It feels like that's like the way that a lot of people that have been around the league for forever is like, hey, the game is won in the trenches, so build up the offensive line, build up the defensive line, and the work that I do when it comes to like following the draft, following all 32 teams in the league, and I listen to every general manager press conference for all 32 teams. I try to listen to as many head coach press conferences as I can. And every coach and every GM will say like, yeah, it all starts in the trenches. But, it all comes down to like, all right, like, do you back that up? Like, do you walk the walk or do you just talk the talk? And I think when you look at the way that Howie Roseman and the Eagles have approached it, they are going to, it's almost like instead of best player available, when it's early in the draft, it's all right, who's the best lineman available? And we're going to address it. Maybe it's not a need right now. Maybe, we might have an all pro in Jason Kelce, but we're going to take Cam Jurgens in the second round because we think that he can be the heir apparent. And he's going to sit on year one. He's going to be a guard year two, and it won't be ideal because you're going to have two undersized guys right on the interior. But year three, he steps right in. He's a Pro Bowler, and he's set up to get a big money extension here this offseason. So, I think that, again, the proof is in the pudding with the way that the Eagles approach team building.
And this should be like the blueprint. It should be posted on every team's website, draft board, or whatever. And the thing that's never been mentioned, or I haven't seen it mentioned where I've looked, is the Eagles won the Super Bowl this year, maybe with their best team ever, after losing a hell of a defensive lineman in Fletcher Cox.
Yep.
And then a probable future Hall of Famer in Jason Kelce. I mean, you lose two guys of that caliber, you would think, well, okay, well, maybe they'll take a little bit of a step back. But the Eagles just keep churning, and they have – we've been talking with the Dolphins. It's like the Dolphins made the moves, the big splash moves, Bradley Chubb, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Ramsey, Teron Armstead. But they have not developed a big base of talent. And the Eagles are the team that they need to look at. This is how you build so that way you can, regenerate when you lose players.
Yeah, and I think that it's the old like draft and develop philosophy. You want to make sure that you're always adding an influx of young talent, in the trenches, and not just in the trenches as in like in the line of scrimmage, but making sure that you have reinforcements and you have that depth, guys that you're bringing along, and it's not just all right once we draft them, like identify talent, but bring them into the building. The Eagles put a lot into their player development staff. They've got 5 or 6 people that are working with that group. They are just basically like they have their pet projects that they work with on the roster, on the back end of the roster. Guys that were late round draft picks or UDFAs that come into the building, free agent signings to say like, okay, like what's one part of your game that we can really just kind of laser focus in on? If it's a defensive line's get off, if it's a linebacker's ability to defeat blocks and handle contact, right? So they just find that one little area. Coaches will say like, can you get 1% better every day? that's that idea of that player development aspect of it, where we're going to take extra care to really develop those guys on the back end of the roster, so that when we need them, because you're going to need them, right? We see it now every single year, where you get into November, you get into December, January, you're dipping into your practice squad in key situations, key games, where you've got to make a practice squad call up, or promote a guy that's down deep on the roster to start and play meaningful snaps. And so you need to be able to count on those players, and that's something that the Eagles certainly take to heart.
And one big area of improvement, very obviously, in 2024 for the Eagles was the defense. And this is where, sorry, Dolphin fans who don't want to hear this is where Vic Fangio comes into play. So my two-part question to you is, how would you put into words the impact and the contribution of Vic Fangio to the Super Bowl title? And then number two, based on what came out of Miami after he left, and the reports of maybe his style didn't mesh with some of the players, what were your expectations once he got there?
Yeah, I think that obviously, you had to pay attention to some of those reports, right? And say like, okay, like what is this going to look like here in Philadelphia? I do think it's interesting, and like I said, I listen to every head coach and GM presser. And so listening to Mike McDaniel and Chris Greer after this season, after the 2024 season, and hearing all of the, how often it was brought up, the player, the punishments that were levied on players for, like, what was it, like being late to meetings and practice and things like that. So hearing that a year later, after all the fallout from the Fangio stuff, I found that to be interesting, and maybe speaks to some of the issues that might be there on that side of the ball, or, in that locker room. But then I think when you look at Fangio and the impact he had, I mean, I can't say enough about it, right? I mean, you talk about a defense that made just a huge jump. I mean, that group in the second half of last year, they basically installed Sean Desai as the defensive coordinator going into the 2023 season, after they missed out on Fangio because he took the Dolphins job because he thought Jonathan Gannon was staying. Jonathan Gannon said he was staying, and then Gannon takes the job with Arizona. Fangio's already gone, so like, all right, well, we can't make that hire now. So now let's go and get Sean Desai, who had worked under Fangio. And honestly, the defense was solid, unspectacular in the first half of the season. They had like a clunker midway through the year. They had, honestly, one of the best performances from that defense in 2023 came against the Dolphins in that primetime game. Kelly Green's, and I think that the defense looked really, really good, in that one. But then when you go, it was just a few weeks later, they decided to make a change. They fired Sean Desai, essentially. They demote Sean Desai. They promote Matt Patricia, and the whole unit just goes to hell. I mean, it was a really, really bad group in the back end of the 2023 season, where guys didn't know how to line up. They're constantly looking to the sideline. There's busted coverages left and right. There's poor tackling. There's poor run fits. I mean, everything fundamentally just looks so bad with that group. And so it's like, all right, now we go in, clean slate, bring in Vic Fangio, a whole new defensive staff for the most part. They kept one or two assistant coaches. But outside of that, you look at Fangio and his impact. Christian Parker, the defensive backs coach, Jeff King, the linebackers coach. They bring these guys in, and honestly, like from the jump, you saw like, okay, we're raising the floor. It's definitely gonna reach at least the middle of the pack defense here this year. First 4 weeks, you saw some flashes, and then there was a really rough outing. I want to say it was week 4 against the Tampa Bay Bucks on the road in the heat down there in Florida, and it was a rough day where guys, it was a lot of wide open receivers, easy completions for Baker Mayfield. They go into the bye, and then Alan, dude, from the bye week on, so week 5, they come back, from the week off. They had an early bye week, and from that point on, it was a dominant defense. And you're talking like the coverage rules on the back end. I talked about how much space there was in coverage, in that game against Tampa. That was no longer the case. The guys were matching routes so well. The fundamentals from a coverage standpoint, they didn't mix up coverages. They weren't like crazy in terms of like, oh, look at this crazy rotation and all these unique things. They played 3 or 4 coverages at an extremely high level. All the rules were buttoned up. The tackling was outstanding, and they just basically like force checkdowns, come up and make a tackle one-on-one. And the 4-man rush got better as the year went on, and we saw what that 4-man rush looked like in the Super Bowl. But I mean, I can't say enough about the impact Vic Fangio had. He's a huge reason why they won a Super Bowl.
Yeah, and I'm accused of being a Vic Fangio fanboy because we're both grumpy old men. But sorry, but the dude can coach. I mean, sorry.
Yeah.
And the thing we noticed with Miami is in terms of yardage, the defense actually improved. There was like from 10th to 4th overall under Anthony Weaver, but the sacks went way down, which is certainly not all of his fault because they had injury issues.
Sure.
With the edge position, but the takeaways went from like 27 or 28 to 16, and that makes a big difference. Last note on the Eagles before we move on to Dolphin stuff, because again, there's a connection here. Jalen Hurts benched at halftime of the national championship game in, I want to say 2017.
Yeah, sounds right.
For Tua Tagovailoa, who pulls it out for Alabama.
Yep.
Now Jalen Hurts, second round pick in that 2020 draft class, Tua was 5th overall pick. Jalen Hurts is a Super Bowl champion now. And there's a big topic. I personally despise the whole. Well, he beat Mahomes. No, he didn't beat Mahomes. The Eagles beat Mahomes and the Chiefs. But having said all that, where do you put Jalen Hurts in the hierarchy of quarterbacks? And part B of the question is the poster child for the idea that you don't necessarily need a Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson to win the Super Bowl?
To the last part of that, I definitely agree. I don't think that you need like one of the 4 elites. I mean, I look the first Super Bowl the Eagles won, they won on the back of Nick Foles, right? It's just that stretch, and he was far from that tier. So now he played at an extremely high rate, in individual games, right? But I remember like down the stretch in the regular season in 2017. It was rough. I mean, there was like talk in Philadelphia, like, do they need to give Nate Sudfeld some looks here, in week 18 just to see like, all right, like, can he give them a little bit of a spark going into the postseason? But I think when you're looking at quarterback for me, I try not to get too caught up in terms of like, oh, is Josh Allen number 2 or is Lamar Jackson number 2 or is Patrick Mahomes still number 1 or should Lamar be up there? You know what I mean? Like I usually don't get caught up in that. The way that I look at it often is basically like tiering. Like if you reach this level, then you are one of this group of 5 guys, 6 guys, 4 guys, whatever it is, right? And then there's another chunk, and then there's another tier, and then there's another tier. There's all these buckets. And for me, I think when you get to, we'll say the top 2 buckets, all these guys that are making at least $40 million a year, that's like half the league. Like half the league starters are in that chunk. And Jalen Hurts is clearly in that bucket, right? He's clearly up in that level. A large chunk of this year, he did not play well. He did not play to his standard, especially in the second half of the regular season. The efficiencies they were down like that towards the bottom of the league. What he did where it was late in the down, he had to hold on to the football and was trying to find open receivers. It was a lot of sacks. It was a lot of throwaways. It was a lot of bad decisions. Nothing down the field. It was a lot of like, I'm going to run, and I'm throwing 3 yards, and it's going to get tackled short of the sticks. It was bad quarterback play for large chunks of the second half of the season. And then he turned it up down the stretch, right? Similar to what we were talking about. So I think when you're looking at quarterback in particular, one thing that does stand out to me, number one, just because a guy is not Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, does not mean that you can't win a Super Bowl with that guy. You do want to build up around him, right? So you look at one of the best offensive lines in football, one of the best running backs in football, one of the best wide receiver duos in football. You feel pretty good about the ecosystem.
One of the best defensive lines in football.
Yeah, exactly. So when you talk about that defense as a whole, right? So the Eagles had the number 1 run game and the number 1 defense, in the regular season. When you pair that with AJ Brown and Devontae Smith and Dallas Goedert, that's a good ecosystem for any quarterback. But I think to me the big takeaway is, what if you have a quarterback that maybe he's not the driving force, but can he step up when needed? That was what we would always talk about on our Eagles show, on the PHLI Eagles show during the year. Was all right. It doesn't need to be Jalen Hurts throws for 350 yards every day or every week, right? You don't necessarily need that. It's more, hey, it's 3rd and 7. The defense got a run stop. There was an incomplete pass. That's 3rd and 7. It's the fourth quarter. Now we need you to come up and step up and make this play, right? Yeah. And so I think when you look at Tua, I think you would put in that boat, right? Is when you have those keys, it's not necessarily about, he threw for 380 yards in an October game against the Denver Broncos, or I'm just throwing random teams out. It's more like, okay, it's December, it's 3rd and 8, you're on the road. Like, can you make that play? Right. And I think that's to me the big thing with all of those and again, it's not all on the quarterback. It's the whole pass game operation in general. Do you have enough around him to elevate him? And then there are going to be times where you need the quarterback to elevate everybody else. If you could do that enough, like that quarterback can win you that Super Bowl. I mean, we look at it, it's like, oh, like, because we had Tom Brady win so many in a row, and then you have Mahomes now who's winning so many. I think we get caught up in the fact that, there are times where, Jared Goff was how close to winning a Super Bowl, right? Jimmy Garoppolo was how close to winning a Super Bowl. We saw one with Nick Foles, but all these other guys, like, you have the ability to get there, to get to the winner circle. You just got to make those select plays when it matters most.
Except this is where Mr. Dolphin beat writer might say, well, it's a lot easier in the NFC where you don't have to go through Burrow, because I'm assuming that's the fourth on your top tier. Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, where Jalen Hurts has to navigate Jared Goff, Jaden Daniels this year.
Yep.
And he's going to be a problem later on, but this was a team with flaws. And then Brock Purdy, who were, again, to me, would be a clear tier lower than the other guys. And but you made a good point. That's why I gave you this. When you talk about Tua, who's a good quarterback, can he deliver in those circumstances? It's still not done. And same with Jared Goff. I won't ask you who's better, Jalen Hurts or Tua, because I don't know if I want to put you in that spot. Feel free to chime in. We had a couple of years ago, Tom Curran covers the Patriots. I think he volunteered. I don't even know if we asked him directly, and he said Mac Jones was better than Tua, and that didn't play well, particularly after Mac Jones's career in New England started nosediving. Okay, I lied. I had one more quick thing on the Super Bowl. Who was your MVP? I want to see if you're like this, if you're completely like this with me.
So as the game was going on, I said they might give this thing to Josh Sweat or Zach Bond. And then as like the third quarter, you started to see Jalen, make some of those scrambles that were so big. And again, like that's, to me, the biggest thing for Jalen Hurts down the stretch, especially, look, NFC title game against Washington, he was lights out. Super Bowl, he was lights out. The big difference was what I was talking about, because in Philly, everybody's like, he holds onto the ball too long. Anyone that doesn't like Jalen Hurts, it's he holds onto the ball too long. He holds onto the ball too long. When you look at the quarterbacks where like the average time of throw is late in the down, like where they hold onto the ball the most, you look at that list and it's like the guys at the top, it's Lamar Jackson, it's Josh Allen, it's Patrick Mahomes, it's Jalen Hurts. It's he's up there with a lot of those guys that are considered the best in the league. The biggest thing is, what do you do on those plays when you hold on to the ball long? It can't just be like sacks and throwaways, and you know what I mean? Like it's what we talked about earlier, but what can you do to attack down the field and really kind of strike fear in the heart of the defense?
Sorry, Fran, hold up. Sorry. I don't mean to cut you off, but I want to get to Dolphin stuff. And I know the viewers and listeners want to get the Dolphin stuff.
Yes.
So quick answer. Who did you think deserved the MVP?
I think I would have given it to Jalen, because I think that at the end of the day, but as the game went on, I think he deserved it.
Okay, and my very quick argument for why to me it should have been Josh Sweat, no questions asked, is because that game was won in the first half when it was 1-0, and it was a defense that was the story in the first half easily. But we can agree to disagree. It's all good. Okay, let's move on to the Dolphins, who have shocker deficiencies on the offensive line, particularly at the guard position, where Robert Jones, pardon me, and Liam Eichenberg were the starters last year. They're both unrestricted free agents. Even if the Dolphins chose to re-sign both of them, let's just say they're in the bottom half of the league as starting guards. And I'm not being impolite to anybody here. The Dolphins had been hoping Isaiah Wynn would be an answer at one of the guard spots, but he never recovered quickly enough from an injury, which happened, ironically enough, since you're my guest, at Philadelphia in week 7 of the 2023 season.
Right. Yep, I remember that.
Traditionally speaking, positional value for a guard at 13 is iffy unless you're talking about a Zach Martin or a Quentin Nelson or somebody maybe a little bit lower than that, but not you're good, perhaps not future Hall of Famer guard. Generally speaking, you would want to get maybe later on. The Eagles had Landon Dickerson, who was a second-round pick.
Yep. And
they had Mekhi Becton, who is a transformed offensive tackle who busted out with the Jets. Do you buy the notion that it's a slam dunk or a very strong consideration that the Dolphins will and should draft a guard at number 13?
Yeah, I think the big thing, one of the most popular choices I see for the Dolphins in mock drafts is Tyler Booker, and where I land on it is he the style of offensive lineman that fits what the Dolphins want? And I think when you look at all the perimeter stuff, and I guess that the big thing is like, what do they want their identity to be from an offensive line standpoint? Because you want to be able to match that, right? And if you're going to continue to be a space team, a lot of stuff out in the perimeter, and getting defenses on the move. Then look, I love Tyler Booker. Booker is actually, I think I'm actually higher on him than most in the media. He's like a top 15 player for me in this class. But I don't know if that's like his strength. He is more of a phone booth, like mash you, a vertical displacement type of offensive lineman. And so if that's the team they want to be, then I think Tyler Booker's a great fit. If that's not what you want to be, and you are going to rely more on movement, and I think that might be like Gray Zabel kind of territory, the offensive lineman from North Dakota State. There's other players that I think kind of fit that. To me, I look at Marcus Bowe from Purdue, outstanding athlete. Armand Membu, the offensive tackle from Missouri. He's another guy, outstanding athleticism, who maybe can play some guard and then shift out the tackle. I don't know what the Teron Armstead situation is at this point. I think that when you're looking at some of these other guys that could be available at 13, they might have more tackle flexibility down the road.
Well, I was going to say this for later, but I want to address that now since you brought up Teron Armstead. If Teron Armstead indeed retires or the Dolphins cut him or however this plays out, they drafted Patrick Paul in the second round last year.
Sure.
If he doesn't start at left tackle, if Armstead's not on the team, something's massively wrong here.
Yep.
So basically my question there is, do you recall what your thoughts were on Patrick Paul coming out of Houston last year?
Yeah, I liked Patrick Paul. I thought that he had solid starting potential. I'm pulling up my report on him right now just so I have it. But I did like Patrick Paul. It was probably a little early for where I had him. I'm just about here. Yeah, let's see. Patrick Paul. Yeah, I had him as an average starter. There was that class last year was so strong. But no, I think that to me that he was a player where I thought that he would need some seasoning. He got that this year. I agree with you. If he's not a starter in year 2, then that is definitely below expectation. But the big thing was that the toughness and physicality. I remember his matchup. From just looking at my notes, I had a matchup that he had with Tyree Wilson in week 2 of his junior year, and he ended up going to be a top 10 pick. Wilson, and he was outstanding in that game. He was a guy like from a technique standpoint just needed a lot of work. And so I think when you look at Patrick Paul, I agree that that's probably a guy that you want starting on the other side or at left tackle. And now it's just a matter of what do you want the identity of your offensive line to be? If they want to be a vertical displacement team, Tyler Booker at 13 makes sense. If they want to rely more on the movement and the perimeter plays, then you probably want to go a different direction.
Yeah, I just don't. The team's been built on the idea of speed ever since Mike McDaniel got here. Right. I have a hard time believing that in one offseason
we're going to pivot.
I mean, you're looking at the wide receivers. It's Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle because I'm still not expecting Tyreek Hill to get traded despite the I'm out bro comments,
right.
From which he has backtracked as one would suspect he would do because he tends to say things for effect, doesn't have a great filter. So for all of those reasons, and I said all along, he's speaking out of frustration because poor dude didn't make the playoffs for the first time in his 9 years in the NFL. That's going to crush anybody's soul. I'm being sarcastic. I mean, that was like kind of an over-the-top reaction. But if you have those two guys and you look at your running backs, it's Von Achane, who's a speed guy again, Jalen Wright, who they drafted last year, and again, in another Eagles connection, they gave the Eagles a third-round pick this year so they could get a fourth to draft Jalen Wright last year. And of course, might be mean of me to say, but since we know this, the way it works out between the Dolphins and the Eagles, whenever they make a deal, watch the Eagles pick a complete stud in the third round this year with the pick they got from the Dolphins. You just know that's going to happen. So I have a hard time seeing them going that whole switch. So, But going back to my original question though, then is it not a little bit rich to spend a 13 on a guard as opposed to maybe in the second round in terms of the impact that player can make in year 1 versus, say, a cornerback, which they now badly need, or a defensive tackle, which they now badly need?
Yep. Yeah, I think so. I think when you're looking at especially the talent on the board here, for this, available for the Dolphins at 13. Look, at the end of the day, I think that the talent at the top of this draft is lacking. I think that when you're looking at like true blue chip players, that's right. It's probably one of the thinnest drafts we've seen at the very top in recent memory. That said, I think when you get to 13, that's where it does start to level off a little bit into the middle stages of round one, and so now it comes down to who's the best player available for us. And I think when you look at defensive line, chances are there's going to be a good interior defensive tackle available to them. Now, this is also an extremely deep defensive tackle group, and so you might say, "Hey, we might get a guy in day 3 or on the third round, or certainly in the second round that can come in and make that impact as well." And so the conversations that'll happen in like early April will be: would we rather have Tyler Booker and Darius Alexander, or would we rather have Walter Nolan and Gray Zabel, right? And you start having those kind of conversations in terms of what your ideal targets would be as you get in there. But you mentioned corner, there's talent at corner in this class, in the first and second round. So I think when you're looking at trying to massage those outcomes, it's going to make for some interesting conversations in the back end of the spring.
Yeah, and then we always hear the old, you going for need, you going best player available. Right. And obviously, I don't need to tell you this, teams like to try to match both of them. They want the best player available at the biggest position of need, if that can happen. And then if you have to make a choice, and this idea I've heard like some media folks actually down here suggest that Chris Greer is always BPA, to which I say, and I will point, with all due respect, I have a hard time believing they had Austin Jackson as the 18th best prospect in 2020, when some of the guys who went after included, Justin Jefferson would be one that jumps out immediately. And I think they were desperate to get a tackle that year. Noah Benogany really the 30th? Although actually, no, you can make the argument that was the best player available because they thought maybe he'd develop into something.
Sure.
Which he started to resemble this year with Washington, actually had a good year, and now he's
a nickel corner for them, yeah.
Yeah. And for those, by the way, thinking maybe the Dolphins should bring him back, well, Dolphins already have a good nickel corner in Kader Kohu, who's an RFA, who the Dolphins should make every effort to retain. One guy who's been mentioned, who I've seen, and I actually wrote a column here on Miami Dolphins on SI.com arguing against him, and my reasoning is this: it's Tyler Warren, the tight end from Penn State, in your neck of the woods. And my point being, this Dolphin team has needs in a lot of different places.
Yeah.
And again, mentioned interior offensive lineman, defensive tackle, an off-the-ball linebacker, cornerback, safety, because Javon Allen's going to leave. Unless Tyler Warren is so much better of a prospect and can make an immediate impact, you're fine with Jonnu Smith coming back at tight end and get somebody else. This would go with need over BPA. Again, unless the gap is that wide. Is the gap that wide with Tyler Warren, or is he just a good tight end, maybe not quite Brock Bowers level?
Yeah, I don't have him on Brock Bowers level, and I think when that's right around the spot where Brock Bowers went, it might be the exact spot where Bowers went. Yeah, right. If he went 13 to the Raiders last year, so but again, I spoke to the lack of talent, blue chip talent in this class, and the way that I kind of display that, I think, is when you look at Mason Graham, the defensive tackle from Michigan, good player. But when you talk about where he's going in the draft, you compare him to Quinnen Williams when he was coming out of Alabama. You compare him to Jalen Carter when he's coming out of Georgia. I'm like, yeah, like he's not either of those players. You look at, Will Campbell, the tackle from LSU. He's not like the top 5 tackles we've seen. Abdul Carter, he's not, if he goes number 1, number 2, he's not Myles Garrett, right? Like he's not that kind of player. Good player, really good player, but a notch below what we've typically seen from guys that go that high. And so that is how I think that, again, getting back to Warren and to comparing him to Bowers, it's that same conversation where I'm not like, yeah, he's not Brock Bowers, but in this class, he will probably go a little bit higher than where I personally would feel great about it in terms of an ROI standpoint. And look, can I close my eyes and imagine Mike McDaniel dialing up some fun stuff for Tyler Warren? Absolutely. You watch Penn State, the way they used him. They got really creative with the ways that they were able to find ways to get him the football. It was really fun, watching that. He was that offense for Penn State this year. They had 0 wide receiver talent, contextually compared to the other teams that they were competing with. And Warren was that guy for them. So, could I see it? Absolutely. But I agree with you. I think there are just so many other holes to fill at more important positions that it would be hard for me to say yeah, this is what's best for the team, especially considering, and this is part of the reasons why when you have a regime that is feeling the heat and saying like, all right, like we're kind of on our last legs, to take to say that we're going to take a luxury pick in Tyler Warren when you've got all these other positions to help you for 2025, that's a tough sell.
Yep. And you just summarized the two biggest points I made is, number one, you have a team that needs to win now. And number two, you have a team that's not necessarily like on the doorstep of the Super Bowl, unless they fill out a lot of needs in free agency, which they can't because they don't have the cap space.
Right.
Another name that's mocked, I only got a couple more for you here. Another name that's mocked quite a bit to the Dolphins is Malachi Starks, the safety from Georgia.
Yep.
It's interesting because, like as I mentioned, he's been mocked at 13 to the Dolphins quite a bit. Daryl Jeremiah, NFL Network draft analyst, did his annual marathon Zoom media session yesterday, and he said he had him more in the back half of the first round than the front half of the first round. Where do you stand or sit, as is the case may be, on Malachi Starks?
Yeah, I love Malachi Starks. I think he is a top 20 player in this draft. And honestly, I would put another safety in there in that group as well, and Nick Amanwari from South Carolina. I think both guys, they're like, if I had a board, like their tags would be touching up on the magnetic board, right? And I think when you look at both guys, and honestly, like Amanwari, my guess is if you were to talk to Anthony Weaver, there are shades of Kyle Hamilton there. And Hamilton went 14 overall or 15 overall to the Ravens a few years back in 2021. And so, I think that the usage would be very similar in that defensive scheme in terms of how they could deploy him. And honestly, like Starks would be the same thing. I think when you look at that versatility there, that ability to line up from depth, but then also line up in the slot, I think that Starks would make a lot of sense. I would not hate that pick at 13. Now, again, we start getting into these conversations in this class. I do think because of the nature of the talent in this class, I think there are going to be some surprises. I think we're going to get to late April. We're going to get to the first night of the draft, and there are going to be guys that have been mocked, on the back end of round one, early stages of round two, that it's maybe it's not the Dolphins at 13, but maybe it's a team at 14 or a team at 17 or a team at 8. I think back to like when Tyson Alualu got drafted by the Jaguars in the top 10, or Dante Whitner got drafted 8th overall by the Buffalo Bills, where it's like, man, like no one saw this coming. I could see that being the case this year. And so, I think Starks is getting a little bit more love than those guys were, but Nick, Amanwari from South Carolina, like that would be one that I could see a team surprising everybody and taking him high. But I think safety would make a lot of sense, especially whatever happens with Javon Holland.
Oh, I can tell you what's happening with Javon Holland.
But goodbye. That's a shame.
Dolphins are not gonna, he's a good player, but he's not. I don't think I'd call him a high impact player. He made one really splash play last year with the forced fumble in the opener against Jacksonville. Outside of that, he always to me has looked better than he actually has played. And I know like a lot of the analytics sites love him. As somebody who's covered the Dolphins his entire career and way beyond that, I don't see it. And then I'm on board with the Dolphins not being willing to move up to the price tag it's going to take to retain him. Have you done a mock draft yet, or that's still?
I did one in January. I can tell you who I had the Dolphins taking.
That's the next question.
And I've got another one. I'm going to do a 2-rounder once we get to post combine. So I'll be doing that one pretty quickly after the combine wraps up. Here it is. Here's my mock draft. This was a few weeks back, so I'm like, I want to make sure I give you the right name here. Where am I? Man,
while you're looking, can you quickly tell me who you have as your top prospect in this draft?
It's Travis Hunter. I actually did something with him, Alan, that I've never done before, where I actually wrote up 2 separate write-ups on him. We've seen guys, like I remember like Adoree Jackson when he's coming out of USC, and he played corner, but he also played receiver. And he was like, oh, like, all right, I'll put that as like an aside in the report. I had to write 2 separate write-ups for him. I think when you're looking at, what he could do as a receiver, what he does as a corner. Now, as a corner, purely as a corner, he's my favorite prospect in the class. As a receiver, purely as a receiver, and the way I did the evaluation there was if he were to fully embrace, hey, I'm only going to be a receiver. I'm not even going to play corner. He's prospect number 2 in this class for me. Now, he would be, if he's going to try and play both ways, I'm of the belief that he has to play corner full-time, receiver part-time. I don't think you can do the inverse, in the NFL. But it would be Travis Hunter. So I've got my mock draft up. This was in the middle of early stages of January. I gave the Dolphins Josh Simmons, the tackle from Ohio State. Basically cited, Chris Greer saying after the season that they're going to have to invest in the offensive line now. Simmons was a player that he played. Now, what I liked about it was that, yeah, he played a left tackle at Ohio State, but when he was at San Diego State, he was a right tackle. So he's got some of that position versatility there. I do think as well that he's got the athleticism to be able to play in a perimeter scheme, but then also he's got that ability to be smash mouth as well, much like what we saw from Patrick Paul. And also, the Dolphins have not been afraid of injury risks, over the course of the Chris Greer's tenure. So I know that can be a sore spot. But Simmons coming off I believe it's a torn patellar, knee injury suffered mid-season. They have not been bashful about going with the guys with the injury risk. So Simmons was a player that I thought would make some sense there.
Okay, and I can mention, by the way, to support Fran's point here, I can mention 3 recent examples: Tua Tagovailoa, Jalen Waddle, who had the broken foot, this is last year at Alabama, and Jalen Phillips, who had all sorts of issues at UCLA. Of course, this is where a smart aleck or anybody, actually a Dolphin fan, would point, well, how'd that work out for them in terms of durability? Waddle's the only one who hasn't missed significant time. Tua has missed significant time for a quarterback. Phillips has had 2 major injuries, and Waddle, though, has been nicked up quite a bit. And we don't need... If we had an episode part 2, we could revisit that whole 2021 draft.
Yes.
I would call it a fiasco for the Dolphins. You would probably call it a success story for the Eagles.
Huge success story.
Yeah, this is why you're covering the Super Bowl champions, and that's why I'm covering a team that hasn't won a playoff game since December 30th, 2000. But that streak is going to end at some point. So I think on that depressing note, we're going to wrap it up. As always, enjoy chopping it up with you. He is Fran Duffy. Catch his work. The best way to access his work, which is on a lot of different websites, is through X at FDuffy NFL. It's kind of the same format I have. No, actually, mine is Poupar NFL on X. Fran, always, as I said, great chopping it up with you. We're looking forward to seeing you at the Combine. Hopefully, we can do dinner. Gang, please like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And in the meantime, have a great weekend.